Welcome back. In this video I'm going to show you how to create materials and shaders using images. Hey there, it's Stephen from the future. I'm just here to tell you that the reason that my viewport by menus come up, for example if I use the apply transform menu, or if I use tab to go into different view modes, it's because I have pie menus set up. So in order to do that, I'll just quickly show you. We go to preferences, and in add-ons we make sure we have 3D viewport pie menus enabled. We can open that up and scroll down and see all the different pie menus that you have access to. And also in key map, you can click on tab for pie menu as well. Now I find the pie menus really fast and quick and easy to work with, and also some of those pie menus give you a few more options that usually you have to dig about in menus for. Okay, so back to this lecture. Okay, so here we are in just a base Blender file, the startup file that I created back in the first section. And what I want to do is I want to hide this ecosphere and the plane in the scene. And let's just drag out this viewport a little bit. Now within this viewport, I want to add a new object. This object is going to be a plane. I'm going to rotate it by hitting R, 90 and X. So it rotates 90 degrees on the X axis. And let's just move it a little bit higher using G and Z. And we're going to scale this up quite a bit. I'm also going to hit N and just go into item, and you can see that our scale has changed. So what I want to do is I want to reset that scale. So we can do that anytime using Control A while in object mode and just hit apply scale. That'll take that scale back to 111 and we won't have any issues with any of the other settings in Blender. Now I want to just move this a little bit away from the camera. So G and Y to move that back on the Y axis at the top here. Close down this panel using N, and we'll add our texture to this object. Okay, so with our plane selected, let's go into our shader editor and click on new to add a new material. I'd also like to mention at this point that you can download all the resources for this Blender file, including all the image maps I'm about to use, in the resources for this lecture. And first of all, I'm going to show you the slow way to do this. Shift A to add a texture, image texture. We'll drag this in, we'll connect the color to the base color. And now if we go into Cycles rendering mode, what you'll see there is we now have this pink color on our image. Now the reason for that is Blender cannot find a file attached to this image. So what it does is it sends up this pink color to let you know that there's something wrong with your shader or with your object, and it's generally because you have an image texture attached within a shader, but you don't have an image selected in there, or the image has moved, or the name has changed, and essentially Blender cannot find that anymore. So with our image texture node in, we can now open a file. So I have some files on my desktop here, and let's see, they are under textures, and it's called Cliff, and we'll open up the diffuse texture. And you can see that we have our image on the screen there. Now it's a little bit hard to see, it's giving off quite a lot of reflections. So I'm going to take the roughness, and I'm going to take the roughness all the way down. And what I think I'll do is I'll actually take out these lights in the scene as well. I'll just make sure the only things that will render are the plane. And let's just take up the strength of the world. Or in fact, let's change this to one of these outdoor scenes, and maybe that might be a little bit lighter. Okay, not terrible, not too bad. When we start adding new textures into this, it should be a little bit clearer. What we'll do is we'll do Shift A, and we are going to add in a new sunlight. So with a sunlight in the scene, I can just move that up. And I want to rotate this towards this object. We'll go to our light settings. And at the moment the strength is at 1. Let's just change it up to 10. So it's really bright. We'll probably have to turn that down a little bit later on. But hopefully now we can see the material a little bit better. So again, we'll select that plane. And we've added in one texture node. We still have quite a few to go. So we'll use Control T with this object selected to bring in our mapping nodes. And we're going to duplicate this node while maintaining this connection. The way we do that is using Control Shift and D. That will duplicate the node and the incoming vector connection will stay attached. So we'll go to our folder. We are going to grab our roughness map. We'll open that up. We are going to connect this into our roughness. And we see a slight update there. There is one thing that we have to change in here. Because we are plugging into a value, we don't want to be using color space sRGB. What we want to do is we only want to use RGB when it's part of the diffuse. Any other time, we want to be using non-colored data or just straight up values. Now, anytime you have a node that outputs a grey value, that's fine to put into roughness, to metallic, to specular, anything like that. But when you're outputting an image-based file, which has a color output, you always want to be changing that to non-color unless it's in the diffuse. We have another node to add, so we'll do Control Shift. We're going to open that up. We are going to grab the cliff normal map and open that up. Now, again, just like the last time when I mentioned we can't output the color into the roughness, in this case, we can output the color into the normal and get a good result. We can try, and you see that we have something happening there. We can see some kind of artifacts happening, but essentially just like roughness is expecting a 0 to 1 value, normal is expecting vector. So we need to convert this color data into normal data. We can also change the color space from sRGB to non-color. You can see there is, again, a slight difference, and you can see a slight result of the normal map, but it's definitely not working correctly. But let's plug it in our converter. So Shift A, vector, and we're going to plug in a normal map. And we can just drag and drop this directly on our node, and immediately you see some of our issues have been fixed. So we can actually see quite a nice result on our image there. We can definitely see that we're getting the effect as if we have additional geometry and different heights on our object. Now, there is a metallic map for this, but that's not really useful for us because at the moment that metallic map is just pure black. So we can just leave that at a value of 0. After all, this rock is not metal, so we don't need to worry about that. We have one more map that we can plug in, which is an ambient occlusion map. Let's use Control Shift D. Go to the folder and we'll grab that ambient occlusion map. Now it's worth just checking out what this map looks like. So essentially it's just a white map with the odd bit of grey in it. Now looking at our principal node, we don't actually have a slot for ambient occlusion. So where do we put this map? Well, the easiest way to include this in your shader is to layer it on top of your diffuse image. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to use, again, another feature of Node Wrangler, which is Control Shift and right clicking and dragging between two nodes, and we get this mix node. In this case, we want to change this to multiply, and let's look at our final output again. And you can see with our factor down at 0, we're getting 100% of our diffuse. Because we're in multiply mode and we have dark values on here, anytime those dark values appear on top of our diffuse, we'll actually darken it. So any value below 1, if you multiply a color, it'll get darker. So as we increase this, we should start to see some increase in the darkness. If you're not seeing much effect, you can always add in a color ramp node in between, and we could bring up the darks a little bit. So you can see some of our areas start getting a little bit darker. We want to be quite subtle with this. So I'll just take it up to maybe about here, just so that it's visible on the screen. And you can see we have this nice rocky cliff edge terrain. So that was quite a lot of work to add in all those nodes. Luckily, because we're using the Node Wrangler, we can use a bit of a cheat, a bit of a shortcut to do this. So I'm going to delete all these nodes out, all the ones we've just added in. And with the principal node selected, we're going to open our tab at the side, go to our Node Wrangler setup, and we do have to make sure our principal node is selected. and we're going to click this button, Add Principled Setup. So when we do that, we're going to be taken to our file view. I'm going to find those files I was using before. In this case, I'm just going to grab the diffuse, the normal, and the roughness, and click on Principled Texture Setup. And immediately what it does is it brings in all those textures in image files. It brings in our mapping nodes as well automatically. It even sets our roughness and our normal to non-color, and it also plugs in that normal map. So essentially we're in the same spot as we did before, but we only had to do a few clicks instead of bringing in a lot of different nodes. And there we pretty much have the same result. I'll leave out the ambient occlusion map this time. And there is one other setting that I want to show you. So this can be quite processor intensive, and maybe if your system is a bit older or a bit slower, this is maybe not for you, but I think it's worthwhile just mentioning it in this video, and that is displacement mapping. So there are about 3 or 4 things we have to do before we do displacement mapping. The first thing is we need to be in cycles mode, which we are. The second thing is we need to be in the feature set of experimental, so we can change over to experimental. The next thing we need to do is we need to set our material to use displacement. So with our object selected, we go into material properties and we scroll down to settings, scroll down a little bit more, and we have an option called surface, and within that we have an option called displacement. Now at the moment it's set to bump only, which essentially means it's only calculating based on the normal map. We're going to change this over to displacement and bump. Now you don't see any change on the object just now, and that's because we have a couple of other things to do. First of all, we need to actually bring in our displacement map. So let's close this tab at the side using N. Let's just click and drag another one of these using Alt, Shift and D to copy that across. You can see we're still set to non-color data. We'll open this up and we're going to grab this cliff height map. Now, one thing to notice is that color space will change back to sRGB because it's reading the file type and assuming it's just an image. We'll change that back to non-color. And you can see that if we drag our material output node all the way down here, let's just make a little bit more space. We have an input for displacement. And again, just like normal map, this is expecting vector information. So we will need some kind of converter. But instead of using a normal converter, we're going to use Shift A, we're going to go to vector, and we're going to plug in a displacement. So what this takes in is a height, a mid-level, a scale, and a normal. In this case, we're going to grab our color, and that's going to be our height. Let's actually look at that height map. So in this image, essentially all the light areas will be brought out from the surface. Any dark areas will go into the surface. And we'll take that displacement and we'll plug it in. So you can see something changed there. Our entire image shot back a little bit in our scene. So the last thing that we have to do in order to get displacement working correctly, and let's just make sure we're in our material, is we need enough geometry on our material to actually make displacement work. So at the moment we just have a plane with 4 vertices. If, for example, I was to go into edit mode, use Control R and add a whole bunch of edge loops, let's take them, let's grab this many edge loops and do the same here. We start to get a result. We start to get some data changing on our geometry. And at this point, it's quite low poly, so we're not getting a massive amount of detail, but you can see our displacement map is bringing some of these areas out and pushing some of those areas in. The way to really get this displacement map working really well is to go to our modifier panel. To add a subdivision surface, we'll set it to simple, so our corners here don't get curved. And we're going to click on adaptive subdivision. And immediately you can see we get a much better result. So what adaptive subdivision does is it doesn't really rely on how much geometry is on your object. at render time, it will actually cut up your geometry based on a pixel value. So you can see in our modifier, we have it set to render at 1 pixel, which means it will cut up for every single pixel in your render, and viewport 8 pixels. So every 8 pixels across on our render, it's essentially adding a line, a subdivision, and that's why we get this really nice result. So you can see our material is looking pretty good on this, and for something like a game object, this would be really good even with much lower subdivisions. Okay, so once again it's challenge time. Your challenge for this video is to find and download some texture maps. There are many resources out there, and a Google search will find you dozens and dozens of websites. I personally recommend opengameart.org. There's a lot of CC0 textures on there, and most of them are very suitable for your game project. Add and create an image-based shader for a basic primitive. Now you can use a plane, a sphere, a cube, anything that suits the kind of texture you're working on. If you can find an image texture set that has a height map, do some experiments with displacement. In the next video, we'll be moving on to the next section where we'll be looking in depth with procedural shaders. So I'll see you in the next section.